We've been blown away by the response to this event, which is officially our largest event delivered online to date. So thank you very much for joining us. Before we hear from Professor Turi King, I wanted to take this opportunity to share a bit of information about the different ways in which you can support the university. So you may have heard about our 100 nominations. As part of the university's centenary celebrations, we want your help to showcase our 100. So that is 100 things that define our past, present and future. And this could be your favourite spot on campus, the most memorable event you went to in Queen's Hall, for example, or an individual who had a positive impact on you. So whether that is a friend, an academic, or someone who was on your course. Our archives and special collections team are always looking for alumni to share memorabilia from your time at university. So if there's something sitting in your loft or in a box under your bed, you'd be happy to share with the team, then we would love to hear from you. We're always keen to hear from alumni who are willing to volunteer their time for various opportunities such as alumni profiles. Profiles are a quick and easy way to volunteer and allow us to showcase the fantastic things that alumni have gone on to do since graduating. And in turn, they help support our student recruitment activities, as well as providing some inspiration to current students who might be interested in following a similar career path to you, or might just be struggling with the university. If you're interested in any of the opportunities that I have just outlined, then a link to an evaluation form will be posted in the chat at the end of the event. So please do complete this and a member of the team will be in touch as soon as possible. Before I introduce Turi King, I just need to go through a few housekeeping items. So please keep your microphones muted during the event. Please feel free to leave your videos on if you would like. It's always nice to see all the alumni that are able to join us, particularly in the virtual settings that we're currently in. And I also encourage you to use the chat and post any questions you have for Turi ahead of the Q&A. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Turi King. Turi is an alumna of the university, Professor of Public Engagement and Genetics, and our 2014 Outstanding Alumni Achievement Award winner. As one of the UK's leading geneticists, Turi led on one of the most famous forensic DNA projects in history during the identification of King Richard III's mortal remains, which were famously found in a car park in Leicester, which is now home to the Richard III Visitor Centre. Earlier this year, Turi also featured in the BBC Two series, DNA Family Secrets, which I hope many of you watched, and using her expertise to help people discover information about their heritage, long lost family relations, and identifying genetic diseases. So I am now delighted to pass you over to Turi.
Hello. Right, I'm just going to share my screen. Let me get this going. And there we go. So today I'm going to be telling you about the DNA35 event that I organized. Oh my goodness, it was just before lockdown started in March 2020. Little did we know that a year from now we would still be in sort of lockdown. So let me just take you through this. As you've heard from Laura, I've been involved in the DNA Family Secrets program. So this is where with Stacey Dooley, and I'm the geneticist on the program. And what we do is we use DNA to answer questions for people. So for example, we've had people who are adopted, they don't know anything about who their parents were. And what we can do is we can use genetic analysis to try and track down living relatives, and we've been able to do that. Other things that we've done is people, if they're aware that there might be a genetic disease in the family and they are worried whether or not they are carriers or not, we can also look at their DNA and tell them whether or not they would be carrying or predisposed towards a particular genetic disease. So series 1 is on iPlayer at the moment, and series 2 is currently in pre-production. And we are actually looking for people to take part in the series. So if any of you have got any kind of genetic family mysteries, do go to the DNA Family Secrets website on the BBC, and you can apply to become a part of the program. So, but today I'm obviously going to be telling you about this story. So this is Professor Sir Alec Jeffries in all his 1980s glory. And he will tell you that his life changed on Monday morning. It was the 10th of September, 1984 at 9:05 a.m. when he did what's known as an autoradiograph, which is this thing on the right-hand side here. I hope you can see my pointer. So each of these is a column. Each column is a DNA fingerprint. And what he was able to see, I think I'd probably still be looking at this 35 years later going, what the heck is that? But when he was looking at this, he went, oh, okay. So what you can see is that each person has a unique genetic fingerprint, and also that you can look at family relationships. So this is a band. These are known as bands. So this band in the child, you can see must have come from the father. This band in the child, you can see must have come from the mother, and so on. So it was this that I organized the event for, because it was going to be 35 years since the publication of the academic paper about the discovery of DNA fingerprinting, and that was on the 7th of March, 2020. Let's move this on a bit. They're going to let me do this. Here we go. Let's try that. So what a lot of people don't realize is actually that the first case was nothing to do with forensics. I know people think about DNA fingerprinting and they think about forensics, but actually the very first case was an immigration case. And what had happened was the DNA fingerprinting, the paper had been published and had got into the news. And there was a lawyer in London called Shona York who had a case that she was dealing with. It was this woman, Christiana, and her son, Andrew. So Andrew had gone back to Ghana to visit his father and came back to London to be with his mum and his siblings. And the Home Office didn't actually believe that he was actually the son of Christiana. And what the lawyer did was she rang up Alec and said, look, can you possibly help with this? And again, what you can see here, I'm going to just close the window and hope that helps. What you can see here, so these are these same DNA fingerprints. And rather nicely, what you can see is, again, you get these bands that are sharing, and you're expecting about 50% of the bands to be shared between mother and child. And one of the people who also took part in it is somebody you'll see in the video later, is David, who was one of Andrew's siblings. And one of the nice things you can see is that sometimes what happens is you'll get a band that's in Andrew, but you also see it in one of his siblings. That's showing you that's a band that must have come from the father. But basically, when you sort of put this jigsaw puzzle together, it showed that Andrew was actually Christiana's son. And Alec will tell you that in all the years of doing DNA fingerprinting, his proudest moment was that one, was being able to reunite that family, and continues to be his proudest moment to this day. The second time it was used was actually to exonerate somebody. So these are very famous around here, 2 rapes and murders, 1983 and 1986, very similar modus operandi. And a lad with learning difficulties called Richard Buckland admitted, or he confessed to one of the murders, but not to the other one. And so with regular policing, they thought, okay, this must be our chap. But they wanted to test this. And the investigating officer at the time, so this was the chief of police, a chap called David Baker, who's lovely, had heard about Alec and thought, I'm going to see if we can use DNA fingerprinting in this case, approached Alec. Alec did the genetic analysis and showed that it couldn't be Richard Buckland who had committed these 2 rapes and murders. So it wasn't until the third time that it was actually used, as part of the evidence against somebody. It was the first case where they did sampling in the villages around where the murders took place. About 5,000 men took part, and they had their DNA tested. And there's a bit of an interesting twist to the story here, because Colin Pitchfork, who was the true murderer in the case, got a friend of his, Ian Kelly, to take the test on his behalf. And then what happened was Ian Kelly went for a works night out, was telling people about how he had given a DNA sample in Colin Pitchfork's name. Somebody overheard it, went to the police. They then went to Colin Pitchfork's house and arrested him. And the DNA showed that it was him who was the murderer in these 2 cases. So it's really quite an incredible story. I don't know if some of you may have seen it, but a few years ago, they actually made a television, like a movie that went over sort of a couple of nights called Code of a Killer. And obviously they then had to cast two of the main characters. So here's Alec, I say, with his rather groovy beard. So apparently he has a beard to hide an acid burn scar he had from when he was doing experiments at his kitchen table when he was a kid. And here's the lovely David Baker, and you can see them being played by John Sims and David Threlfall in Code of a Killer. And one of the really nice things is that obviously it was filmed on campus, and Alec got to make a guest appearance. So here you've got John Sims as Alec. This is David Threlfall as David Baker, and this is a scene where the two meet for the first time when David Baker is coming to talk to Alec about the possibility of using DNA fingerprinting. And I don't know if any of you have spotted this, but there's the actual real Alec doing a little cameo performance in the background. He walks up the stairs as the two of them meet. The other thing I wanted to do was I wanted to bring together the families from this, because we hear a lot about Alec and a bit about David, but you know, there were real sort of heroes in this case, and these are the families of the two girls who were killed, who were part of this first case where DNA fingerprinting was used to actually catch the killer, and you don't often hear from them, and so I wanted to bring them into the story. So this is the event, and it was basically to mark the publication of this paper, this hypervariable mini satellites in human DNA, which was the very snappy title of it. As I say, so it was to mark the anniversary of this globally important discovery at the University of Leicester. I wanted to bring together the key people from the first cases to talk about the impact of DNA fingerprinting on their lives. And it was not only to honor Alec, but the first people who played a part in this. So one of the things that I also organized alongside this, and I'll show you a couple of little video clips about this in a second, was the first one was an honorary degree for David Baker. So I was really surprised to learn that the university had not yet given him an honorary degree. And I thought this was a tremendous oversight. And so me and Alec and our press officer and Simon Cole, who's the chief of police now, wrote a case for David to get an honorary degree. And I also wanted something to sort of honor Don and Barbara, and so organized for a PhD scholarship in their name. So I'm going to show you a couple of little videos about those now.
The university has a tradition of having honorary degrees. It is a way of the university recognizing outstanding achievements from anybody in the society who's done something good. We take pride in, and we want to celebrate by giving them an honorary degree. And I'm proud to tell you that in July this year, David Baker will be getting an honorary degree from this institution. He will get a proper certificate in July. That is just a letter.
So of course, little did we know that actually he wouldn't get the degree in July, and we are still waiting to hopefully give him that in person. He's had it as letter form so far. And then, as I say, the next thing that I organized was something for Dawn and for Barbara, and I'll show you that now.
I'm humbled to announce that in memory of Kathy and Barbara's family members, the College of Life Sciences and the university is going to endow in perpetuity the Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth PhD scholarship to support the first step in a future scientist's career.
So that's the end of my presentation. You're now going to see a video from the event where I was speaking to people who were involved in those first few cases. And then I understand you'll have the opportunity to ask questions after the event. Right, so I'm just going to introduce you all. You all know Alec. Now, we have David Gimya, who was involved in the very first immigration case. We have got Linda Eaton, who was involved. She was actually the sister-in-law of Kath Eastwood, who is over here. Yep. And then we've got Barbara Ashworth, and then we have got David Baker. So Barbara is the mother of Dawn Ashworth, and David Baker was chief superintendent at the time, who led the investigation into the Enderby Narborough murders. So I'm actually going to start with you, David, because this was the very first case where DNA fingerprinting was actually used. As I say, so I actually teach this, and most people don't realize that actually the first case where DNA fingerprinting was actually used was actually an immigration case, and David was part of the family that was involved in that. So what do you remember from that period?
I'm probably, if you allow me, I'm also a journalist and academic, so I'm about to spin your question around.
Go on then.
As you do. If you don't mind, just a sort of little caveat before, because, and I want to tell you a bit of backstory, because Turi was saying, please come and chat, and you'll notice that I'm not here with my brothers and sisters because it's a really deep emotional thing for them. I know one person who would have loved to be here, and that would be my mum. She was the tour de force behind this, liaising with your good self and the Law Society. But sadly, she passed away around this time last year. So in itself, it's quite an emotional thing. And the family really felt that they would rather sort of pull back. But having said that, I thought, you know what, why don't we just use this opportunity to thank fantastically two main people. And that is Professor Alec Jeffries. And that is also my mum, because really without my mum keeping this family together and pursuing what she did, you know, this wouldn't be the situation today. So I'm sort of stealing your question away from you to use this as a platform to thank. And then there's there are other sort of bits and pieces I can add afterwards, which are strange little arcs of how I've got to where I am as a consequence of this. But I might let you ask that question.
Okay.
You can tell I'm a journalist.
So talk us through the story. What happened and how were you involved in it?
Okay. Again, I'm going to be quite guarded because I don't really want to make it about any individual. It was a situation where it was traveling back after a long holiday, and there was confusion amongst the immigration about the status of the family, said person, brother, and it seemed to, it was, you know, nobody seemed to want to believe that we were a family unit, that we were one another. And I'll say something which is actually quite interesting here. And I'm reflecting on something that Stormzy, Stormzy in the house? Yeah. Yes. Stormzy said something recently when they asked him the question, he went 100%. And it was misinterpreted as to say the whole of the UK is 100% racist. He didn't mean that. 100% just means true. Now, I mean, coming from Ghana, it's easy to call someone who is your mum, auntie. It interchanges. And so that word was used, and immigration thought, well, why in heavens would you call your mum auntie? And the consequence of that, therefore, became this kind of confusion. And it sort of labored and it went on, and mum was the nurse. She was up and down, toing and froing. If you search the TV archives, I think there's even some stage where we're on This Life with Leicester Hudson, good God. But what then happened is I remember it was a last straw. It was this kind of last gasp attempt to how do you resolve this? What do you do? And not of my doing, but of the Law Society. And I was just talking to Shona, yeah. And I was just speaking to Professor Jeffries, who tells it much better than I do, actually, I suppose. No, you do. And it's just an article that was printed in The Guardian, and it was a paragraph, was it?
The one paragraph.
The one paragraph that this amazing solicitor stroke lawyer picked up and thought, well, let's go through this. Why not? And my mum said, yeah, okay. And the consequence of that was the case going before immigration. And you also tell me another story today that I've just heard for the first time, that within 2 minutes or so, they went, yep, and just dropped it. So 2 years of angst in 2 minutes was just wiped away. And that's really how, that was it. That we are where we are today. And Mum, as I say again, was the real fighting force here, in ensuring that, she didn't give up. And on behalf of our family, absolutely grateful to you for what you did. Now there's a little funny side to this, because the consequence of that was I found you were Dr. Jeffries at the time, weren't you? Oh, you was, you see. I thought, God, this is really interesting. At the time, I was applying to go to uni. So I went to, at the time it was called Leicester Polytechnic. And then I did a degree in applied chemistry, thinking, oh, I like this. There's someone in the house today who broke me into radio, Vijay Sharma, thank you. Dr. Vijay Sharma. And at radio, because of that, when I did my postgrad, my dissertation was on genetic fingerprinting and Huntington's disease. And at the time, I got to interview him and Baroness Warnock, the late Baroness Warnock. I didn't let on. I sort of just did the interview and then pulled back. He doesn't know this. But the flip side to that, as a way of acknowledging the impact, was that when I was doing my doctorate at UCD, we were looking at narrative storytellings and patterns. And I remembered really well patterning and how you can take a story and you can identify where it comes from in terms of neorealism or whatever it is, third way. You can, when you look at news, we do news in a certain way, but you can look at areas and through the patterning, identify where it comes from. And some of those ideas actually emerge from that itself. So that's the sort of arc which I sort of take away from me as to what it's and how it's kind of helped me and what he's done for me and the family at large.
Fantastic. So, I mean, for Alec, obviously for you, it was the first time that it was actually ever used. Was it a case of Shona, who can't make it today, but sends, tremendous hugs and kisses to all of you, basically? But did she just simply ring you up and say, I've got this case? Yeah,
I think I can't remember if it was a phone call or a letter, but it was certainly within weeks of publication. Yeah. I mean, she'd approached and said, look, we've got this very, very difficult immigration dispute. I'm representing the family. It's been dragging on, I think, for 2 years. So this is a long, protracted business. I think it was there were significant health costs for your mum when she was suffering. And anyway, as David said, it went to an immigration tribunal and they just dropped the case. And sometimes people will ask me about, all the things that have happened to you. Was there ever a magic moment? And I know exactly what it was. It was at that immigration tribunal where Sheena was inside the tribunal, I was outside with your mum. Sheena came out, they dropped the case against your brother, and Sheena came out and said, go and tell this lady that everything's okay. And it was this big hug and the look in your mum's eyes, a sudden lifting. It was a terrible burden she'd been carrying for 2 years. That was the magic moment. Forget all the rest of it. That's the moment that I would truly value. Very important.
Thank you, sir.
How lovely. Right, so we're going to turn to the first forensic case now. And obviously it's not appropriate to go into it in detail, but in short, in 1983, Linda Mann was killed. In 1986, Don Ashworth was killed. And these incidents happened in the Enderby and Narborough. And I suppose what I really want to do is concentrate on the girls. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your daughters. Tell me about Dawn. What was she like?
Oh, she was a wonderful daughter. I was lucky enough to have a girl, being my firstborn, and then Andrew, a son. 17 months between them. They were like that for each other. And you think you have every blessing. And then you get the rug pulled from under you. And that's the only way I can describe it, because you lose the camaraderie that you had between your children within the house, and life has to carry on for them. But Dawn was very sensible. For her age, she lived a very full life. She had a Saturday job, which she loved, and even with the small amount that she earned when she went on that Saturday job, it was amazing. There was always a bunch of flowers from me, and there was even one there when she went missing.
Yeah.
You know.
She sounds like a lovely girl.
Yes, she was. She was. Well, you know, I made the most of the time that I had with her. Since, you know, thinking good, happy thoughts. Yeah. That's all you have left.
So tell me about Linda.
Well, a daughter, the same, but she'd already got a sister of 2 when she was born in the July, so it was nice summer time. And from then on, it was all activity, colour. She loved colours. She loved to draw fashion on lady sketches and things, and it was just full on family, very busy, very happy, and local community was brilliant, and very good at school, both of them, and they go on, you know, and grow up and become, as they get to teenage, you know, it's that age coming up, and she was big. She knew where she wanted to go. She had the direction. She got the strength. She got the brain. And she knew. And life just carried on as normal until suddenly, that's it. It stopped, changed. And there's nothing more to say. You just can't put words to it.
I know you had quite a lovely story about Linda, about how she was a bit shy, wasn't she, in a photo? You were telling me at one point.
Our wedding photo. My husband is Kath's brother. And when we got married on the wedding photos, Linda wouldn't look up. She was only about 2 or 3, wasn't she? Can't remember how old she was.
Just coming up to 3, I think.
Yeah. So everybody's saying, everybody look at the camera, smile, and there was Linda, like this. And we kept saying, Linda, look at the camera, please look at the camera. No, like this. And then we realised what it was. She'd got chicken pox and she didn't want anybody to see her spots on our wedding photo. So we've got some lovely wedding photos with Linda with her head down. And you can't see her.
I've got all the others, don't worry.
That's fine. But she was a cheeky little thing. And as soon as she looked at you with those big brown eyes, you knew that whatever she was asking for, she was going to get. Because she just looked at you like, and you'd gone. Absolutely. Absolutely.
She sounds lovely.
She was. Yeah. She was a part of our family, wasn't she?
Of course,
and she still is. Both the girls still are.
Very much.
Yeah.
So David, this was where you came in, obviously leading an investigation into these tumours, which must have been of incredibly high pressure. How did you come to know about Alec's work and come to contact him? What was the story there?
Well, the story was that we'd got a young man in custody who was admitting or making certain admissions to the murder of Dawn, but was totally denying any involvement in the murder of Linda. We'd got other circumstantial evidence which went along with what he'd said, and as a result of that, we'd charged him with the second murder. We interviewed him at some length, but there was a total denial of any involvement in the murder of Linda Mann. So in consequence of that, we needed something else. We'd got his blood group, which was similar to samples from both girls, but that was 40% of the population. And I'd read an article which appeared in the Leicester Mercury, which involved Sir Alec and the paternity tests which he'd done, which brought the DNA into being. And of course, that could bring the blood sample down to the individual as opposed to a percentage. The lowest percentage that we could get was 12.5% by view of subgrouping. So we asked Sir Alec, can you do this for us? Can you do the DNA test? So we sent the samples off of the young man and Linda Mann, and the result came back that he wasn't responsible for the death of Linda. So in consequence of that, I've sent the samples from Dawn and asked for the same test to be done. And that test came back negative. And of course, what also came back was the fact that the man in custody wasn't responsible for either murder, but there was a man out there in the community who had committed the murder on both girls, leaving his samples behind. So of course we've got to start from somewhere, then from square one. Now we'd already been through the inquiry once and twice with house-to-house inquiries and various interviews and interrogations of people, and it had come back negative. So we needed then to put something else to the equation, and so we decided to use DNA as a sample of obtaining a sample from every young man that lived in the vicinity of the villages of Narborough, Enderby and Littlethorpe. And so we set about obtaining blood samples from all of the men in an age group of 18 to 34. And these were sent away to Aldermaston to be examined. And of course, at that stage, we needed, quite a lot of blood from everybody. And we needed doctors and phlebotomists and other medical people to do it. So it was quite a big job.
So what was it like in the villages? I know you were saying the uptake was great. You were saying the atmosphere in the village was actually quite good, wasn't it?
Yes, yes, it always has been. I mean, it was like stepping back in time. It was very sort of everyone knew everyone else. And I never noticed the fear and that was going around because we were too busy. I mean, our lives were shattered. And we were trying desperately to sort of cling on to some sort of normality and, vetting every phone call that you had or this, that and the other, people trying to get some response, back from you. So I was never privy really to how frightened the community was as a whole. I mean, when you think about the implications of having, someone else and people looking over the shoulder and but I don't know, we'd switched off from all that. Yeah. It was, we didn't register anything really at all, as I say.
And Kath, do you remember, what was it like? Quite a few people took part, didn't they? They seemed to be very pleased to help.
Everyone seemed quite happy about it.
Yeah.
But it was the fact that it was bringing up, obviously, family disputes along the way. And the community was beginning to break up a little bit. Change. You could feel a change.
Yeah.
But the people who took part were amazing. They just walked in dozens. Very pleased with that. I mean, you couldn't ask for more. But we didn't know at the time, how it would work out because it had never been done, as far as we knew. We didn't know what it was about, this DNA, quite a very new thing.
Yeah. And this was your idea, wasn't it? It was based on something that had been done previously with fingerprints before, wasn't it? It was your idea.
There'd been a case some years earlier where manual fingerprints had been requested from the occupants of a village where a murder had been committed. And of course, it was the process of taking the fingerprints which led to the arrest and conviction of the individual in that village.
Mm. So it was presumably with that in mind that you thought, right, let's try this with blood samples and go around the villages and see.
Well, we certainly needed something else, because we were looking at everybody who lived, worked or played sport or visited the area. So we got quite a database of people to go through.
And there's a twist to this story though, isn't there? Because it didn't work out quite how you thought it was going to.
We'd anticipated what, you know, may happen, that somebody would try and dodge the system or would refuse to give a blood sample. And then, of course, we would be able to hone in on them and identify who that was. And one of the things that we did was we sent a letter to everybody we wanted the blood from and asked them to bring with them a passport or driving license or some other photographic identification, because we knew then that if somebody got somebody else to do it, then somebody else would know that there was something going on. And of course, that's exactly what happened, is that there was a party from a bakery where our man worked, and he wasn't there, but there was a number of his fellow employees. And during the evening, a young lady that was in the company overheard a conversation from his accused that he'd taken the blood test for this man. And in consequence of that, she came forward and told a police officer some days later that she knew, and it was immediately passed on to us in the incident room. And of course, we identified the two men responsible, and we arrested both of them on the same day, the one that had taken the blood test and the one that had asked him and supplied the passport. And of course, he was arrested and charged. And as soon as he was arrested, he admitted the murder of both girls. Subsequently, we did a DNA test on him, and that corresponded with the samples that we'd obtained from the two girls. So it was game, set and match.
That must have been an incredible feeling to have all of this sort of come together, all the police work, plus the genetic work. How did that feel once it all come together?
It was a sense of relief.
Yeah.
I mean, it was you realised that it was a job well done. And of course, it was the consequences of the work we'd done with DNA, which enabled us to come to the conclusion that we did.
I mean, it was such an extraordinary story. Did you know then just how big it was going to be? Did you feel it then?
Yes, we realised the importance of it, because it brought the samples of an individual down to one, as opposed to a high percentage of the population. So instead of being 40%, it was down to the individual. And I mean, that has proved paramount in all the investigations using DNA today.
Now, I didn't know this, but actually someone who's been heavily involved in the university in the last few years was actually instrumental in part of, well, not in the investigation, but he was part of the whole story. And it's a chap here called George Davis. And so I would like to invite George Davis up to the stage to say a little bit of something about how he was involved. And he was going to be interviewed by Phil Baker.
Good evening, everybody.
Can I have a... It's all right. Oh, Jackie, it's all right. I thought you said something.
No. So just to continue the story a little bit, George, I know that you know Barbara, and I think you wanted to say how you knew her and how that friendship formed.
Well, at the time I'd started Next in '82, and I was living quite locally. I was doing really well, and basically I've always been somebody very close to people. I never say people work for me. I say they're colleagues, they work with me. And lovely Barbara here was working with me. And then we had that disastrous news that day when Dawn, her daughter, had been taken on a towpath, and it was just unbelievable, you know, that it was somebody connected with us. Anyway, then the young chief constable up here got in touch with me, and he said, because you were struggling, we put out all the DNA, and he said, would it be all right if we did DNA testing on everybody at Enderby? And I probably had about 300 or 400 people. And it wasn't one of the things that you had to say you do, but everybody in my team said, yeah, of course we'll do it. So they came and did it. It went on for 3 or 4 weeks, and they weren't making any progress. So I got another call from David saying, would you personally like to put up a reward? I'd made a bit of money, and I thought of course it's worth helping people. And so I remembered I put 10,000. Barbara told me today it was 20. It obviously helped when like 10,000 was probably about 60,000 today. And this young lady was talking in a club, I think you mentioned it, was talking at a club, and she found out that the guy had stood in. This girl discovered this, and rightly, she got the reward. And I think what I think is amazing, because even though I'm a Merseysider, I do feel I'm very close to Leicester, and I still am. I think it was a massive team effort, and I have to say, this man, I've always followed him, and the thing that's amazing, if he developed Google, if he developed all these things that people make fortunes, but if you publish a paper as a surgeon, a doctor, you don't get a penny. And I think all the better this man, and he deserves his knighthood. And I would like to congratulate you for the work you did.
Thank you. You too. Well, so it falls to me to say a tremendous thank you for all of you for being part of this. It has been a really wonderful thing to organize. I'm so grateful for you all to come along. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you all.
I hope you enjoyed that video. It's really fantastic to see how a discovery at the University of Leicester has really made a difference to the people, rather than kind of just focusing on the research. So now we will move into the Q&A. So the first question I have for you, Turi, is what has it meant to you to work with the brave families of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth?
Well, so for me, it was purely as a organizing this event, but to me, it meant an absolutely huge amount to be able to involve them in this event, because as you say, quite often you hear about the research, you hear sort of about the people at the forefront of the research, but one of the really big things about DNA fingerprinting is that it's had a massive impact globally on millions of people's lives, not just in terms of forensics, but in terms of immigration cases and you know, disease and you know, all kinds of wildlife studies, things like that. So I guess it meant a lot to me to get some of these first people involved in these cases, and I still natter back and forth to Barbara. Colin Pitchfork is up for parole. He had first part of his hearing last month, and they are now waiting to have the second part. And so I text her and just say, hey, I'm thinking about you and I hope you're doing okay. It meant a huge amount to have them involved.
Definitely. Rosie Rochester has asked, having seen the DNA Family Secret series, how are you able to pinpoint the exact geographical locations of relatives?
Okay, so this is usually the ancestry stuff and looking at this kind of thing. So what we do is, or what genetic direct-to-consumer testing companies do, is they take your DNA and they don't sequence all of it, but they sequence like little bits of it. And then what they do is they look at what's the genetic variation that you have, and they take little chunks of your DNA and they will match it against people in the database. And these can be people from all over the world. So for example, one of the stories that we had was Janine, and she didn't know anything about who her father was or where he was from. And so what we were able to do with her DNA was to do this genetic testing, and all of the matches that came back that weren't from the UK, which we knew must be her mum's side, were all coming from sort of the Punjab region. And even more than that, what I was finding was that when I was looking at, you know, who are the people that she's matching, it tended to be people with Sikh, Jat Sikh surnames. And so not only were we able to say something about where her father has come from, but we were even able to say something about what his likely ethnicity was going to be.
So if someone was looking to start looking into their family history and find out their heritage, what would be the starting point for them if they're trying to do it themselves?
Yeah, so I always say start with family first, because they, you know, start with your parents, start with your grandparents if they're still around, get their stories now whilst you can. So it's a combination of genetics and genealogy. In terms of doing the genetic side, go to one of the really big testing companies. And these are things like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe or Family Tree DNA or MyHeritage. All of them have got very, very big databases. Ancestry's got the biggest database at the moment. So they're most likely to give you hits if you're wanting to know about whether or not you've got distant relatives that you don't know about. You're more likely to find people, because the answers that you get back are only as good as the people who are in the databases. So if they don't have a reference population, say for, I don't know, Japan, for example, you won't get any hits in Japan, and that's not because you may not have ancestry there, but it's because they've got no reference samples for that. So that's why the databases and the size of the databases is really, really important. And it depends on whether or not your relatives are in there, whether or not they've taken tests, whether or not you'll be able to find one another. But I always say start with one of the really big testing companies and go from there.
Fantastic advice. So the next question for you is from Katie Solomon. So Katie has asked, given the advances in DNA sequencing technology, how soon do you think we'll be able to have a quick DNA test be conducted at a crime scene?
Oh, that's already happening. Wow. So they're already able to do stuff where they take sort of a DNA testing kit in a briefcase, and they can actually do DNA testing very, very quickly. It's not the standard thing that people use, but it is possible to do that sort of thing. Whole genome sequencing is becoming cheaper and cheaper. It's now under £1,000 to get your entire genome sequencing. So there is this thing about, in future, will it be that when a child is born, they will have their entire genome sequenced? And as we start to know more about disease, for example, will they be able to know about their genetic predisposition towards particular diseases? So it's a hugely rapidly moving field. So a lot of the stuff that I used to think, ooh, that'll never happen, it's already happening.
The advancements in technology.
That's right.
So this is a question and a statement from Ian Harwood. So Ian has said, Professor Sir Alec Jeffries is one of the most eminent scientists the UK has produced and has been awarded the Coakley Medal, but to date has not received a Nobel Prize for what has to be one of the greatest discoveries of the last century. And he's asking why not?
That is a very good question, and it is something which I have routinely brought up, going, how is this possible that Alec has not won the Nobel Prize? I mean, it's one of the greatest scientific discoveries of all time. I don't know. We don't know why he hasn't won it. It's one of life's great mysteries, and if there's any way my understanding is that they don't like being lobbied. So, but I don't know how else to do this. But yeah, it is something he absolutely should have won the Nobel Prize before. He's won every single scientific prize in the world, apparently, other than that one.
Wow, fantastic career then, absolutely. So another question is kind of what are you currently working on? What are your research topics or current projects, briefly?
So some I'm not allowed to talk about because I'm under confidentiality agreements, but things like Jamestown, Virginia. So this is the first permanent English settlement in the US. So 1607, you have got settlers going over from the UK, and they're actually settling and staying. And I was over there a couple of years ago as part of an excavation in the main church there, and they think that we might have found the remains of a chap called Sir George Yardley. So he presided over the first representative government in the US, so the start of democracy in the United States of America. And at the moment, I've got DNA from him, but we haven't got a relative to be able to compare the DNA to, and that's our sticking point with that particular project. Another one I'm working on is Robert the Bruce, potentially the remains of Robert the Bruce. So I've got what seems to be a little bit of potentially his toe bone. And so I'm trying to see whether or not I can get DNA out of that. And it looks like there's DNA in there, but I don't know how much of it's him and how much of it is actually just bacteria and rubbish we're not interested in. But we do have a relative that we can compare the DNA to, but I'm stuck because it's been the pandemic. And to being able to travel, to be able to go and do the work in ancient DNA labs has basically kind of shut down that side of my research for the last little bit, but hopefully we'll open up again soon.
Yeah. No, so you do, so your research kind of is international, I suppose. So you do lots of research in different countries as well as the UK.
Yeah, so it's samples that come from different countries. So another one that I've got going at the moment is King Denis of Portugal. And I had to look him up because I didn't know who King Denis was, but he's one of their most famous medieval kings. And at the moment, I've got a little bit of his femur because what they would like me to do is to see if we can work out what his hair and eye color was. So similar to what I did with Richard III, being able to look at those genes that are involved in pigmentation and say something about what his hair and eye color was.
Fantastic. It seems like you're going to be quite busy.
Yeah. As soon as they kind of like open the doors, I was like, I'm going to run. There's so much work to catch up on.
We'll be on the first plane available.
Yeah.
So another question from Jessica Thrower is, do you feel that DNA is going to become more popular within the fields of genealogy as opposed to the more traditional historical research through records and archives? And what does this mean for the accuracy in terms of genealogical research?
That's a really, really good question, because one of the things I always say is don't rely on just the genetics. You absolutely have to run it alongside the genealogical research, not least because when you do these genetic tests, often, it'll come back and it'll say you shared this amount of DNA. And that suggests that you are at about the second cousin level, for example. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's second cousin. It could be first cousin, once removed, etc. And that's where the genetics kind of gives you a steer, but you have to do the genealogical research to actually be able to build the family tree. And genetics can only help you for a certain number of generations outside of using things like the Y chromosome, which comes down through the male line. But the vast majority of our DNA only tells you about the last few generations. So that's where genetics, the power of it starts to run out after about 6, 7, 8 generations. And what you really then need is the genealogical information. A really good, well-referenced genealogical tree is hugely powerful.
Yeah. I think we've got time for one more question. So this will be the final question. And I suppose it's quite relevant to the current situation we're in. So the question is, could DNA screening contribute to COVID-19 research in the future?
Ooh, it already is. And actually, the UK is absolutely 100% at the forefront of this. We are completely on it. So two things. So in terms of screening for coronavirus, what are the versions that we've got? The fact that we found this version that's called the Kent version is actually because we do so much DNA sequencing of coronavirus. So we pick up these little mutations as they arise, which then allows people to start to go, okay, so what is that mutation likely to do? Because the whole thing about the genetic structure is it will change the protein structure of the virus, and that may allow it to kind of stick onto our cells better and that kind of thing. And then the other thing that we're really interested in is obviously, is there anything genetic predisposition in terms of severity of disease, that kind of thing. So yeah, we are absolutely on that already, and we've got researchers at Leicester who are already on that, doing that. Yeah
no, that's fantastic to hear. So thank you very much, Turi. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the questions. So I'd just like to thank you, Turi, for joining us today, and for everyone else who's joined us this afternoon. I hope you found it informative and quite moving as well, watching the video and seeing the impact that DNA fingerprinting has had on the families. So we will be sending an evaluation form in a follow-up email tomorrow, so do please keep an eye out for that. And we will be keeping the meeting live just for a few more minutes. As you'll see, there is a link in the chat currently, so we'll just leave that available for you to click on. But all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for joining us.